to yet another edition of the Middle Georgia Spotlight. I'm your host, Jack Ellis. Thank you so much for being with us here this week, and we appreciate you being with us on each and every week here on the Middle Georgia Spotlight. And we ask that you view us on YouTube, like us on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube, and share us on YouTube, the Middle Georgia Spotlight with C. Jack Ellis. In the Spotlight this week, he loves to go by the name of H. Michael Harvey. Some people know him as Harold Michael Harvey, but he goes by Michael Harvey. Attorney, author, native of Macon, has a long, long resume, an attorney, so we're going to let him tell us exactly who he is, what he's about, why he's here today. Welcome to our program.
Thank you, Jack. It's my pleasure to be here and to be in the spotlight for Middle Georgia Spotlight. I'm just a guy that grew up in Unionville, okay? Had a lot of challenges in life growing up in Unionville, and went off to college at Tuskegee Institute, finished there, and came home and worked with Alex Havisham over at the Macon Courier. I was the campaign poster for Reverend Julius C. Hope, who was
we want to talk about that. Yeah.
First black man to run for mayor in the city of Macon, Georgia, and we thought we had him in there. And of course, 20 years later, you came along and you broke that glass ceiling. And so sometimes after that, I went left Macon and went off to law school and practiced for about 17, 18, 20 years. I'm not currently practicing. But I started after closing my office in 2005 or so. I started writing books. You know, writing was my first passion. Maybe my second one. Baseball was my first passion, and then I developed the craft of writing. And so I went back to writing, and I've written about 7 or 8 books for myself. I've ghostwritten about 15 books for other people, and that's sort of who I am and what I'm about.
Well, that's a lot, but you know, you are very modest, obviously, when you describe yourself, but I've read several of your books. The one, a memoir, and we have a copy of it here, and we, of course, recommend it to people, called The Freaknik Lawyer. And, of course, we'll get into why that name. We know what Freaknik meant back in the day in the 90s, but why you were called the Freaknik Lawyer. But let's talk a little bit about politics in Macon. I stand on your shoulders, no question about it. As you said, you laid the groundwork that made it possible for me to become mayor, becoming the first African-American mayor. But, of course, the man that you managed his campaign, the late Dr. Julius Caesar Hope, known as J.C. Hope, you managed his mayoral campaign. Like you said, you all came very, very, very close. And so at what point in your life, I know you were born out just outside of Macon.
That's right.
And according to your memoir, born out in Crawford County, but you came to Macon as a very young boy, 11, 12 years old. Mm-hmm. And somehow it looked like you have always had it, based on your in your memoir, that you always had it in you, this drive to force the issue, if you will, and that activism. Where did that come from?
I think that came from my mother, and she probably got it from her mother. My grandmother was very astute in history. She was a farmer's wife, and so she was a very quiet lady, but in the fields, when we were out in the fields picking cotton and raising okra and peas and so forth and milking the cows, she would always tell us about history. She would say, President Eisenhower did so-and-so today, but let me tell you, President Roosevelt, she didn't say Roosevelt, she said President Roosevelt, and she may have been talking about the first one, Theodore, as opposed to Delano. He did so-and-so, and that's why Eisenhower followed up and did what he did today. And so I was always getting these history lessons. And one of the first lessons I got about resistance and pushing the envelope was that my family in the early and mid-1950s were very proud of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. So almost all of my life I've heard the phrase, Jackie Robinson, he broke the color barrier. And for a long time, until maybe I was into my teenage years in the 1960s, before I understood what breaking the color barrier meant. And of course, so that comes from my grandmother, Puella Coley Harvey, and my mother. And you know, that's sort of like where I get that drive. And then when we get into Macon, 5 years later, there's this opportunity to integrate the Lanier Junior High School for boys. Now, the senior high school had been integrated by a group of young men, and Miller Senior High School and McAvoy and Willingham Senior High Schools had also been integrated by a handful of black seniors in the 64-65 school term. And so the 65-66 school term, the opportunity came to integrate Lanier. And when I heard the news by Dr. Williams, you know, who was down at the Board of Education for many, many years, but when I was in 8th grade, if you may recall, he was a radio announcer on WIBB. He would come on in the early morning hours and play gospel music, and then when he would get out the air, he would head over to Ballard Junior High, where he was the assistant principal, or he may have been the principal of the junior high school, I can't recall. But in any event, he came over the intercom system one day, May of 1965, and announced that Judge Boodle had just issued a ruling that we were going to have this system called freedom of choice, that any student in the city in Bibb County could go to any school they wanted to of their choosing. And I ran home that afternoon after the bell had rung and ran in the house looking for my mom, and they asked if I could my school of preference was Willingham. And she wasn't in the house, and I ran outside and I found her at the clothesline hanging up clothes. She had done laundry that day while we were in school. And as I was blurting out what the announcement was, Gerald had hustled home.
Gerald being your older brother.
My older brother. He had hustled home and found us in the backyard. And I was about to get to the point where I wanted to go to Willingham, and Gerald said, well, I want to go to Lanier. And so my mama quickly said, well, you all can do it, but you got to go to the same school. And of course, Gerald was a big brother. So that's how I ended up at Lanier as opposed to Willingham.
Now, talk to a little bit about the experience. Now, this was 1965.
1965.
This was after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And those days I was already in the military, so I had left Macon. But what was it like? What was the atmosphere like in 65? What was the resistance? What was the pushback like for a young black man, boy, you would say those days, a young black young man, I would say, a young black young man going to this, what had been the storied school, goes back many, many years, named after Sidney Lanier, the great poet, the Civil War veteran hero for Macon, and was a lawyer, by the way.
That's right, sure.
So what was it like for you going into that? Was it, explain to us, if you will.
Well, there was a lot of resistance that came from the white kids at the school. And of course, you know, I didn't expect that. I thought because the judge had said that you could now do it, that, you know, it was a done deal. It was an easy thing to...
That you would be readily welcomed then.
Yeah, and, you know, get an education. But that was not the case. And the particular morning, the first day of school, it was, I think I arrived at the junior high school before any of the other 12 black kids did. And this is how that happened. Gerald and I, after having breakfast, Gerald and I walked up Pinona to our friend Frank Everett's house. And Frank had a car, and so we all piled into Frank's car. I think we may have been joined by Thomas Miller, who lived in Vining Circle. And so we were and we all got in the car, and we drove towards Lanier. Well, they let me out at Henley and I can't think of the off street now, but where the junior high school was. And they let me out on the corner. They turned right at the corner and headed up to the senior high school. And so I had to get out and walk the rest of the way to the junior high school. And so I hear all this noise, this clamor, as I'm walking towards that horseshoe that was where the buses would turn around and let off the kids who came in from the county. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the closer I got, I quickly discerned that it was 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate, but I kept stepping. I kept walking.
These were young white boys.
These young white boys about my age. We were all 8th and 9th graders. Okay, and so they're gathered on the outside of a building. And as I get closer, I swallow hard, and I'm thinking like, wow, couldn't they at least have driven me to the horseshoe or let me get down in front of the building? But I had to walk down the street to get to the horseshoe to enter the property, and then walk towards the front of the building where the kids were congregated. As I reached this circle of kids, there was a white man in an open collar shirt, crew cut haircut, broad shoulders, came and parted the crowd and pointed to me and said, "Come go with me." And I followed him into the building. He carried me into the principal's office and introduced me to the principal. He disappeared. I never saw this man again. And I sat in that room until one by one, the other 12 kids were brought into the principal's office. And when the bell rang, we could hear the noise subsided on the outside of the building. And we could hear just general chatter now as the kids walked down the hallway going to their homeroom class. And after the building grew quiet, at that point, the kids were in their classrooms. The principal came and he gave us our class assignments and told us that we could now go to our homeroom. And so by the time I arrived in Mrs. Chapman's class, she was my homeroom teacher, there was a seat for me in the back of the classroom. And of course, everybody was waiting for me to walk in. And so
Were you the only black young man in this class?
Yeah, I was the only black young man in that class. And I think in PE there may have been one or two more blacks in the PE class. And I may have had a science class where there was another black person in class, but primarily there were so few of us that the odds of you having more than one black kid in the class was very slim.
How did you feel? Were you intimidated? Were you encouraged? Were you discouraged? Were you say, I'm here? Did you feel that you were carrying the race on your shoulders, if you will, at such a young age, 13, 14 years of age? How did that impact your thinking?
I did feel like I was carrying the race on my shoulders. That is when, that day is when it dawned on me what Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier meant. So now I understood that there was no other baseball player in Major League Baseball on April the 15th, 1947, when Jackie Robinson stepped out on that.
So you had no fear, in other words. You didn't fear being there. You didn't say, boy, I wish I would have decided to stay at Ballard Hudson or what have you.
Well, I think I was a little intimidated walking towards the school when I got out of the car. And the amazing thing so we were in a surreal world. Frank Everett was a very funny young man. He was sort of like what was the kid on Leave the Beaver? Haskell, you remember the Haskell kid? Eddie Haskell. Frank he looked like Eddie Haskell, and he was as obnoxious as Eddie Haskell was. And so he had us just rolling as we were driving towards school that morning. And so it was sort of like what we were embarked upon, our minds were taken off of that, momentarily. But as soon as I got out of the car and I heard the chants, now I'm intimidated, and I wish that they had actually driven me, onto the campus. But after I got into the class, I could feel the weight of what it meant to be one of 12 other black young men at Lanier Junior High School.
With all the other, especially with the chanting and all that, very similar to the Little Rock Nine, I'm sure, the experiences that they had there. But so you stay at Lanier, you graduate from Lanier. Now, what about when you got older? Did this continue in the senior high school as you got into your I read in your book where you wanted to, your activism kicked in, you wanted to celebrate something during Negro History Week. I think we call it the time of Black History Month. Maybe it hadn't even started. So at that time, I guess did that ignite a fire in you to become this activist that you ultimately became?
I think it helped. Now, growing up in the segregated black school, elementary school that I had grown up in, every February, every teacher in the school had pictures on their bulletin board of Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Mr. Garrett, Mr. Morgan,
Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman, yes. Any number of black historical figures. And we would have assembly programs it was actually Negro History Week.
Yes.
Back in the 60s, but it started in 1926.
1926, Carter G. Woodson, yeah.
Carter G. Woodson as Negro History as a day.
Yeah.
And so by the time I come along, it's essentially a week, and basically the third week in February, I think that was a week where you had both W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass were born.
Yeah.
And so that was the week that it was celebrated. Typically on a Friday we would have, in the black school, we would have an assembly program where we would pay homage to and learn about black people in history. And so that had been my upbringing. And of course in the 9th grade at Lanier Junior High School, no such thing happened in February. And in the 10th grade, no such thing happened at Lanier Senior High School. And in the 11th grade, no such thing happened in February at Lanier Senior High School. So for my senior year, 1969, I decided that that the black students should teach our history to our white classmates.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're running short on time, but I want you to finish that. So I want you to tell us the resistance that you had and the success. I know about it. I know how the story ends, but share with our audience so we can move to another subject.
All right. First resistance is that I had to convince black kids that we needed to do this. All right, because seemingly the way we got by is that we didn't cause any attention to ourselves, and we knew that if we decided to celebrate our heritage, that it would put us, front and center. So my idea was for the Friday, the third Friday of February 1969, we would wear a suit and tie. Okay. Now some of the kids didn't have a suit. Some of them didn't have some of them had a tie though, and so I ran into resistance from my black classmates until finally I had this bright idea, and that I stopped and I started calling several athletes. Kenneth Nixon, who was the oldest brother of Norm Nixon, the Laker basketball player. And Kenneth went on to play basketball at Mercer University, one of the first black kids to play over there. J.T. Thomas, who
played for the Steelers.
But also was the first black football player at
Lanier.
At Lanier. Well, no, Calvin Cummings was the first senior player at senior high school. But he was the first black football player at Florida State University.
Florida State University, that's right.
And you had Sonny Lester, who I believe, Ernest Lester. You may know Freeman Lester as a realtor. Well, his oldest brother, Ernest, to me, in my humble opinion, is the best athlete to come out of Macon, Georgia in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Okay, better than J.T. Thomas, better than Kenneth Nixon, better than Isaac Jackson, Ernest Lester. And then I also called Isaac Jackson. I got them to agree to do it. And then I would call the other classmates and say, well, kids is going to wear a coat and tie. Isaac Jackson just told me, just got off the phone with Isaac Jackson, and he says he's going to wear his coat and tie that day. And so I got 100% agreement. And so that Friday we walked to school, and I was met on the campus. When I walked on the campus, I was met with raised fists, and the brothers was beaming, and they were smiling, and their chest was pumped out, and they were saying, "Right on, Brother Harold, right on, Brother Harold." And so by midday, the major in charge of the ROTC program that we were a part of called me into his office and told me that he was going to hold me responsible if I was in trouble. And I said, and that was Major Carter, who ended up being, I think, president of the Macon City Council.
And he was served as mayor for a while.
And he was served as mayor. That is right. He said he would hold me responsible if I was in trouble. And I said, well, we came in our Sunday best. We didn't come to fight. We came to display our heritage. And then after that conversation, I got a message that the principal, Elton Wall, wanted to see me in his office. And he read me the riot act also. And I gave him the same message I had given to Major Carter. That we in our Sunday best. If you're going to have any trouble, you're going to have it from the white boys. You're not going to have it from us. And
so it was a success.
It was a very success. Around about 2 o'clock, the guys started loosening the collars, the ties. But I can still see the pride that those young black men had. I can see those puffed out chests. And so it was worth it for us to put our culture on display that day.
So now you go off to Tuskegee University, Tuskegee Institute at the time, now Tuskegee University. You're an athlete. You play on the baseball team. You had some great experience there. Now you graduate, you move back to Macon. So now what kind of Macon did you discover? We know what you left in 1969. When you came back 4 years later, what type of Macon did you encounter in terms of race relations and things of that nature?
Race relations hadn't changed. The same dirt streets I left in 1969, my parents' middle-class home was built on, was the same dirt streets I returned home to.
And the relationship between the citizens was still had separate but
unequal facilities and housing conditions. All the streets in the white areas of Macon were paved, but in the black areas they weren't. They would send those tractors out once or twice a month.
I remember them. Scrape the road, they would call it.
And when it rained, it was muddy. When it was and sloppy.
Dry, it was dusty.
And dusty. And, in the summertime, that's where we played. We didn't have a recreational facility because in 1967, Grace Hill is where I played baseball up until 67. And then the city who owned that property sold the property to the Nolan Construction Company. And they built the Nolan Construction Company on it. So that was, so in addition to that ballpark being there, there was a swimming pool.
Yes, I remember.
That was also there. And so that ended those facilities in the black community. So there was no recreation. And there was dirt streets. And I remember my sophomore year in college, I invited my girlfriend who lived, who grew up in Birmingham. I invited her home during the Christmas vacation that year. And so we headed out one Friday night for Macon. And just before we got outside of Macon, it started raining. And by the time we got to my parents' home, the streets were good and muddy. And so, ring the doorbell, Mama comes to the door, let us in the house. And, after we get settled, the girlfriend says to me, "You live on a dirt street?"
You never told her that, huh?
I never told her that, and I never thought it was a big deal because living on a dirt street, growing up in Macon, Georgia, it was the reality.
Commonplace for most black.
Most
black.
I didn't think that was any other way, right? But I vowed that night that when I finished school, I would work to get those streets paved. And so the following year, Harold Harvey, David Lucas, I, and a young man from Chicago, Illinois, I can't remember his name, we had a class down in the engineering building called State and Local Government, where we learned about block grants. We learned about how the state government apparatuses operated, how city and county governments operated. And, we pledged that we were going to come back to Macon and we were going to bring about some changes. Well, there's two changes I wanted to make. I wanted the recreational center and I wanted my streets paved. And so one day, Frank Johnson, who had nurtured Gerald and I in the Boy Scouts, we were in Boy Scout Troop 50, and Frank Johnson was the scoutmaster for that troop. Yeah. And he also was a member of the church that we had attended, Bethel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church up on Pinona. In fact, my family joined Bethel because the first day when we moved to town, Frank Johnson came by. He was walking his neighborhood. He always walked the neighborhood as long as he could walk. You could always see him in the afternoon when he got home from work, out walking and checking on neighbors. And he was doing that day. And when he discovered that we had been CMEs up in Crawford County, said he was and invited us to his church.
Well, you did a lot. You got the streets paved and you got a recreation center built. And I was honored enough when I was mayor to make sure that recreation center was named in his honor. So we owe you a great debt of gratitude for your work. Now we have about 2 minutes left, so I want to talk about we want to talk about another thing that you're working on now. Another thing with a book. It's called The Fantasy Five. Now the Fantasy Five is about politics. It's about the first African Americans becoming city council people here. We have about 2 minutes to wrap this up.
I'll try to do it. This is a very important book. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the election of the first 5 black members of the Macon City Council. Until 1974, it had never happened. And until 1974, it was unlikely.
74, 75?
74, actually.
Okay.
Their first term in office, they were sworn in on December the 12th, 1974.
Okay.
But of course, the buck of their first term
was 75. Okay.
75, yes. And so I released the book in 24 to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And I was hoping that the city of Macon or organizations would take it upon themselves to do a commemorative service in honor of these 5 individuals. But nobody did. And so the last surviving member of the original 5 was Reverend Dr. Eddie D. Smith. And so he transitioned about a month ago, and I drove down from Atlanta to his memorial service. And on my ride back home to Atlanta, I had this epiphany. It seemed like God spoke to me and said, if nobody else is interested, then maybe that's a job for you. You should do it. So I've started a committee to get together to have a commemorative program in their honor this December the 12th, 2025. I'm on the mayor's calendar. Dr. Fickling has placed me on the mayor's calendar. The mayor will read a proclamation honoring the 50th commemoration of their election, and then we'll follow that with a dinner down at the Tubman Museum at noon. So we'll have 2 events on December the 12th commemorating this 50th anniversary. And those 5 people are Willie Hill, Mr. Vinson, you got Eddie Smith,
Dolores
Brooks, and Vernon Colbert.
Well, we want to thank you for the work that you do, even though you live in Atlanta now, but this is still home, and you're still coming back and giving back to this community, and we appreciate that. We appreciate you recognizing these 5 that paved the way for people like me and others who became elected officials later in our city. And only 50 years. I mean, that's not a long time when you think about it. The city was started in 1823. So it wasn't until 1974. And of course, you paved the way for a lot of that to happen. So again, congratulations and thank you and good luck with the event. And we allow time for people to get ready for it, December the 12th. of 2025. I look forward to being there, God willing.
God bless you. I hope to see you, and we've got a little surprise for you that evening.
Well, thank you very much. And he's a great author here again. Go on Amazon. I'm sure you can find the various books that you've written.
Well, actually, at HaroldMichaelHarvey.com, Amazon costs, they take 55%.
Oh, okay.
Profit,
Okay.
So,
Well, go again now.
HaroldMichaelHarvey.com.
.com. You can find all your work there.
All my work there. You got Fantasy 5, Freaknik Lawyer we talked about, and one you just held up is My C.T. Vivian Story. Dr. Vivian,
Great civil rights.
Great civil rights leader, aide to Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
We were neighbors for 27 years, and it was nothing for him to knock on my door at 8 o'clock in the morning and sit down at the table and drink coffee. And
I read the book. It's it's an inspiring book. No question about it. All of them are. Good work. We want to thank you all so much for joining us this week here on the Middle Georgia Spotlight for our special guest, Harold Michael Harvey, better known as H. Michael Harvey, attorney, author, civil rights leader, activist, and just a good brother. And we thank him for being with us, and we thank you all for being with us. Until next week, I'm your host, Jack Ellis. Goodbye.